everybody, and welcome to another ASMR video here on the channel. Now in tonight's video we are covering a creature, cryptid, monster thing that we somehow haven't done on the channel before. In tonight's video we are going to be talking about vampires. Are they real? Are they not? Realistically, probably not. But ultimately we are going to be firstly going over what they are, their history / origins, and how the notions of vampires has developed throughout history, and then we'll be looking at a few accounts of people who believe they have truly come into contact with a real life vampire. So hopefully you find this video informative, entertaining, and as always relaxing. Without further ado, let's get into it. So a vampire in popular legend is a blood-sucking creature that rises from its burial place at night, sometimes in the form of a bat, to drink the blood of humans. By daybreak it must return to its grave or to a coffin filled with its native earth. Tales of vampires are part of the world's folklore, most notably in Hungary and the Balkan Peninsula. The disinterment of Serbia in 1725 and 1732 of several fluid-filled corpses that villagers claimed were behind a plague of vampirism led to a widespread interest and imaginative treatment of vampirism throughout Western Europe. Vampires are supposedly dead humans who maintain a kind of life by biting the necks of living humans and sucking their blood. Their victims also become vampires after death. These undead creatures cast no shadow and are not reflected in mirrors. They can be warded off by crucifixes or wreaths of garlic and can be killed by exposure to the sun or by an oak stake driven through the heart. The most famous vampire is Count Dracula from Bram Stoker's novel Dracula from 1897. So, what are the characteristics of a vampire? Well, because there's a long history of walking corpses and blood-sucking ghouls in folklore, it is difficult to pin down a distinct set of characteristics consistently attributed only to vampires. Central to vampire myth, however, is the consumption of human blood, or other essence such as bodily fluids or psychic energy, followed closely by the possession of sharp teeth or fangs, with which to facilitate this task. In most depictions, vampires are undead, that is to say, having been somehow revived after death, and many are said to rise nightly from their graves or coffins, often necessarily containing their native soil. Vampires are typically said to be of pale skin and range in appearance from grotesque to preternaturally beautiful, depending on the tale. That's not me saying that word, but I'm moving on. Another frequently cited characteristic is the inability to cast a reflection or shadow, which often translates into an inability to be photographed or recorded on film. A person may become a vampire in a variety of ways, the most common of which is to be bitten by a vampire. Other methods include sorcery, committing suicide, contagion, or having a cat jump over a person's corpse. Didn't know that one. Some people believed that babies born with teeth on Christmas or between Christmas and Epiphany were predisposed to becoming vampires. While vampires usually do not die of disease or other normal human afflictions, they are indeed often said to have faster than normal healing capabilities. Vampires are often depicted as being repelled by garlic, running water, or Christian implements such as crucifixes and holy water. In some stories, vampires may enter a home only if they've been invited, a bit like the TV license people. And in others, they may be distracted by the scattering of objects such as seeds or grains that they are compelled to count, thereby enabling potential victims to escape. So let's have a little bit of a look at the history. Creatures with vampiric characteristics have appeared at least as far back as ancient Greece, where stories were told of creatures that attacked people in their sleep and drained their bodily fluids. Tales of walking corpses that drank the blood of the living and spread plague flourished in medieval Europe in times of disease, and people lacking a modern understanding of infectious disease came to believe that those who became vampires preyed first upon their own families. Research from the 20th and 21st centuries has posited that characteristics associated with vampires can be traced back to certain diseases, such as porphyria, which makes one sensitive to sunlight, tuberculosis, which causes wasting, pellagra, a disease that thins the skin, and rabies, which causes biting and general sensitivities that could lead to repulsion by light or garlic. Vampire myths were especially popular in Eastern Europe, and the word vampire most likely originates from that region. Digging up the bodies of suspected vampires was practiced in many cultures throughout Europe, and it's thought that the natural characteristics of decomposition, such as receding gums and the appearance of growing hair and fingernails, reinforced the belief that corpses were in fact continuing some manner of life after death. Also possibly contributing to this belief was the pronouncement of death for people who were not actually dead. Because of the constraints of medical diagnosis at the time, people who were very ill, or sometimes even very drunk, and in a coma or in shock were thought dead, and later miraculously recovered, sometimes too late to prevent their burial. Belief in vampires led to such rituals as staking corpses through the heart before they were buried. In some cultures, the dead were buried face down to prevent them from finding their way out of their graves. The modern incarnation of vampire myth seems to have stemmed largely from Gothic European literature of the 18th and 19th centuries, about the time vampire hysteria was peaking in Europe. Vampiric figures appeared in 18th century poetry, such as Heinrich August Ossenfelder's Der Vampire in 1748, about a seemingly vampiric narrator who seduces an innocent maiden. Vampire poems began appearing in English about the turn of the 19th century, such as John Stagg's The Vampire in 1810, and Lord Byron's The Giaour, Giaour, from 1813. The first prose vampire story published in English is believed to be John Polidori's The Vampire in 1819, about a mysterious aristocrat named Lord Ruthven, who seduces young women only to drain their blood and disappear. Those works and others inspired subsequent material for the stage. Later important vampire stories include the serial Varney the Vampire, or Feast of the Blood, and The Mysterious Stranger from 1853, which are cited as possible early influences for Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1897, and Théophile Gautier's La Mort Amoureuse from 1836, which translates as The Dead lover. Dracula is arguably the most important work of vampire fiction. The tale of the Transylvanian count who uses supernatural abilities, including mind control and shape-shifting, to prey upon innocent victims inspired countless works thereafter. Many popular vampire characteristics, such as methods of survival and destruction, vampires as aristocracy, and even vampires being of Eastern European origin, was solidified in this popular novel, and especially through its 1931 film adaptation starring Hungarian-born actor Bela Lugosi. The novel itself is thought by some to have been inspired in part by the cruel acts of the 15th century Prince Vlad III Dracula of Transylvania, also known as the Impaler, and Countess Elizabeth Bathory, who was believed to have murdered dozens of young women during the 16th and 17th centuries in order to bathe in or possibly drink their blood so as to preserve her own vitality. Dracula in turn inspired the film Nosferatu in 1922, in which a vampire was first depicted as being vulnerable to sunlight. Other aspects of the movie, however, were so similar to Stoker's novel that his widow sued for copyright infringement, and many copies of the film were subsequently destroyed. For several decades, the vast majority of vampire fiction, whether on page or stage or screen, showed the influence of Dracula. Both the novel and its film version spawned several direct sequels and spin-offs, including the film Dracula's Daughter in 1936, and a number of Hammer films including Dracula, also known as Horror of Dracula. Vampires became popular characters in pulp magazines and appeared in stories such as Sherlock Holmes' tale The Adventure of the Sussex Vampire. In 2009, the original author's great-grandnephew, Dacre Stoker, and Ian Holt published a sequel called Dracula the Undead, using notes and excisions from Dracula. In the 20th century, vampires began to turn from being depicted as predominantly animalistic creatures, and instead displayed a broader range of human characteristics. Ray Bradbury explored the sympathetic portrayal of what can be thought of as monsters, including vampires in Homecoming in 1946. A story about a normal boy with a family of fantastical creatures. The popular American television soap opera Dark Shadows featured a lovelorn vampire, Barnabas Collins. In 1975, Fred Saberhagen published The Dracula Tape, a retelling of Stoker's story from the misunderstood villain's point of view. Vampire fiction entered a new era, however, with the sympathetic portrayal by Anne Rice in her novel Interview with the Vampire in 1976. Rice's book introduced the world of vampires that were brooding and self-loathing and squabbled like humans. While Rice's vampires were more vulnerable emotionally than vampires previously had been, they were less vulnerable physically, susceptible only to daylight and fire and the death of the first of their kind, and possessed superhuman beauty, speed, and senses. Interview with the Vampire was highly popular and sparked a revival of vampire fiction that lasted into the 21st century. And subsequent vampire stories continue to use characteristics established by Rice. Rice herself wrote several more books in what subsequently became known as the Vampire Chronicles, some of which were later adapted for film. The vampire as a misunderstood romantic hero picked up steam in the later part of the 20th century, particularly in the United States. In always an erotic experience. In many tales, vampires are characterized as promiscuous, their appetite for human blood paralleling, yes, their sexual appetite. In 1991, Laurie Herder published Obsession, one of the first vampire novels to be categorized as romance rather than science fiction, fantasy, or horror. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, a television show in which the title character has a star-crossed romance with a vampire, aired from 1997 to 2003. Vampire romances also appeared in the steamy HBO television series True Blood, based on Charlene Harris's Suki Stackhouse book series. Vampire romance for teens gained popularity at the end of the 20th century and beginning of the 21st, with books such as the Vampire Diaries series and the Twilight Saga. The Twilight Saga, with its high school romance and vampires that sparkle in the sun rather than bursting into flames, became a cultural sensation, ensuring a vampire trend for years to come. Vampire relationships of a different sort were explored in the novel Latin Rate Goma from 2004, which translates as Let the Right One In, by John Alvide Lindquist, in which the main characters are a perpetually childlike vampire and a young boy she befriends and helps fend off bullies. The book was adapted for film in Sweden in 2008, and in the United States as Let Me In 2010. Vampires also enjoyed popularity as unlikely action heroes. Blade, a half-vampire superhero who first appeared in comic books, was the focus of 3 films. Another popular film series, Underworld, explored an ongoing war between vampires and werewolves. Dracula himself, known instead as Alucard, even became an action hero in the Japanese manga and anime Hellsing. Angel, the vampire with a soul and the love interest of Buffy the Vampire Slayer's title character, became the star of his own spin-off television series, in which he acts as a private detective. And the tabletop role-playing game Vampire the Masquerade, which contributed words such as sire and embrace to the vampire lexicon, allowed players to create their own vampire worlds and pit warring factions against one another. Although vampires had by the 20th century largely become creatures of fantasy, urban myths about vampires continue to persist. As late as the early 20th century, some villages in Bulgaria still practiced corpse impaling. In the 1960s and 70s, a vampire was believed to haunt Highgate Cemetery in London, and in the early 21st century, rumours of vampires caused uproar in Malawi and England alike. Okay, now we move on to a real-life account of, that was no pun intended, of somebody who apparently had a real-life run-in with a vampire. It's apparently written by a doctor of sorts, so it all started out seeming like a pretty routine visit. My patient was in her early 30s and had come into the emergency department for weakness and was in no distress. As I was talking with her about her symptoms, she would flash the occasional smile. It was then I noticed that she had fangs. Not the kind that some people naturally have from misaligned teeth, but she had really long, sharp canine teeth. She had some tattoos and a variety of piercings, so I just figured that the fangs were also a part of her look, perhaps a new trend that I'd never seen before. She was coherent, articulate, had good hygiene and had no psychiatric history. Aside from the fact she seemed like a fairly average 30-year-old. Your blood work shows that you are anemic. Have you been having heavy menstrual periods? I asked as I reviewed her lab results. Also, your white blood cell count is elevated. Have you been sick lately? I've always had abnormal blood counts my entire life, but not due to heavy periods or illness, she said. What have your doctors told you it was due to in the past? I asked. My doctors have never been able to tell me why, she said, and then she hesitated. Flushing her fanged grin, she went on to say, I am into some unique things. She was a little reluctant to open up, but with a little encouragement she did. I am a vampire. I drink human blood, she told me. I immediately had to put on my poker face, as I was about to lose my professional straight face. It was one of the craziest things I'd heard in a long time. I knew the movie Twilight was popular, but couldn't believe that there were people who took their love of vampires to this level. Immediately rushing through my head were thoughts of all the potential infectious diseases that she could possibly have, like hepatitis or HIV. There are times when I crave a flesh meal. I am craving one now, she continued to say. My spine tingled as she said those words, and for a split second I wondered if I was safe alone in the room with her. But she was so non-threatening and calm that I decided to continue. I was intrigued and had to learn more about this. So you drink other people's blood. How do you get the blood? You could get hepatitis or HIV or other infections doing that. She went on to tell me that she had one donor who gave her his blood, and that she had gone with him to the doctor to get tested for Hep and HIV and other bloodborne illnesses. He shared his results with her, and that is how she knew he didn't have any infections. Wait, so there are people who want to donate blood to vampires? How did you find your donor? I asked, fascinated by what she was telling me. There are websites for real vampires to find donors. There's an entire community of vampires and donors out there, throughout the country and around the world, she explained. Really? I was very intrigued by all that she was saying. It was one of those moments where you hear about something completely new, and you just have to know more. What about your fangs? How did you get those? I asked. I had them filed that way. Many of us vampires have them done like this. Or you can get caps that go over the teeth, she said, pulling her lip up, so that I could appreciate the full view of her fangs. She too was enjoying this conversation and my intrigue. After we talked a little longer and I had learned all about her vampirism, I told her that I was highly concerned about her habit of drinking blood. We talked about the various infectious diseases to which she may have been exposed. Next, we came up with a treatment and follow-up plan, and I told her it was imperative that she get tested for a variety of blood-borne diseases. In researching for this blog post, I have learned more about real vampires, as they like to be called. Contrary to the vampires of novels and Hollywood films, real vampires do not attack random people and bite into their necks, nor become bats at night or live for eternity. They are real vampires in that they do believe they need blood or psychic energy from others in order to feel healthy and to overcome a perceived deficiency in energy. Those who feed on aura or pranic energy are known as psychic vampires, and those who feed on blood are called sanguinarian vampires. They have willing donors who allow them to drink their blood. They follow certain rules about where to cut their donor and how much blood they can safely take from them. Many of the donor/vampire relationships are well established and long-term. The donor is often treated well by the vampire, so that the vampire does not lose the relationship. There are also lifestyle vampires who like to dress like them, but do not require blood or energy from others and are not considered real vampires. In contrast, real vampires like my patient believe they are born with this vampiric condition, and that it is not something that they choose to have. Many believe their life would be easier without this condition. It's hard to know how many real vampires there are throughout the US, or the world, because many real vampires do not openly reveal their vampirism. In many ways they can seem pretty average, as my patient did, and may not stand out as vampires at all. They hold all sorts of jobs and may be single or married, and some are patients as well. Vampires do indeed walk amongst us, and they may one day walk into your ER or office or grocery store. At least now you won't be spooked when you meet one. We're going to end this video on vampires with a story from Reddit. Our good friend Reddit, and this is apparently a real encounter. So, meeting a real vampire, a strange experience. 2 days ago I was with my friends at a party. Everything okay and boring for me because I cannot drink alcohol. I have stomach problems. Nevertheless, we had some fun, left the party early and went to a friend's house to chill. After a couple of minutes, I heard some of his friends come to join us. Several hours passed, and because it was getting very late, I wanted to leave for home. Some friends of his had decided to take me home in the car, and before we reached the car, we saw several men out in front, many of whom looked drunk, but I wasn't expecting any kind of trouble. As I walked past the car to get to the back seat, waiting for the owner to let me in, a man approached from that group and told him to get inside the house because he was needed by someone. It appeared to me the owner knew this guy because he did exactly that. Without opening the car or telling me anything, I just stood there for a couple of seconds, then decided to walk back in the house to see if he's still willing to take me home, or should I go on my own. I'd had my driver license suspended due to an accident a few years ago. I went in the house, couldn't saw to see the owner, and said goodbye again to some friends while I was thinking of my journey home, because the public transport at that hour, 4 AM, doesn't operate. I live in Eastern Europe, by the way. I don't know if in the US the public transport system differs, but in that same time, the man that was outside apparently walked into the house with 2 more guys, catching my attention. He had medium brown darkish hair, slim with loose clothes, very common looking actually, but that wasn't the thing that caught my attention. When he entered the house, I just had a strong feeling coming from him that I cannot describe that well. He looked at me, he had dark brown glassy eyes, didn't say anything, but then he started to move around, and like nobody was noticing him, even the 2 guys that went with him, and that's when I realised his movements were so unnatural or weird. Like as if he was going further, it seemed like he was going backwards. His arms were behind his body as he moved. The feeling I had was not fear though, like he would be scared of the unknown like ghosts or demons. This was a feeling I had a few times when someone died, or saw something very graphic and gore related. Kinda the same feeling, and my brain just rewired in a way, like you suffered a real psychological trauma. I swear I could feel it in my brain. It was the same feeling I had years ago when I watched someone falling off the stairs with blood running from their ears. It was not fear, but this kind of sick feeling. He looked at me intensely, which seemed to be for a very long period, and I couldn't move. I remember opening my mouth halfway and just staring back at him, eyes wide open and fixating my vision on him, but didn't want to make eye contact. Subconsciously, I think I told myself not to look for some reason. He never spoke a word, or nobody spoke to him. He went straight for the door after making these rounds inside the house. And for a second he stood under the door entrance and turned his head again to look at me. He was pale white and in a way evoked the same feeling in me as before. He left. I tried to gather and tell myself there was nothing wrong. Nothing wrong at all. And I left my friend's house for home. I forgot about the whole thing while outside. I was freezing, and while I was walking in the snow, feeling sleepy and tired, until I saw him again near a closed travel agency building. He was ahead of me, leaning against the glass walls. He didn't seem to notice me, but I knew then that it was him. I switched sides on the sidewalk to get some distance, and with one eye looking over in his direction, he noticed me halfway and smiled shortly. I couldn't see his face better because of the snow and distance, but I noticed his mouth was deep, red, almost bloody. I picked up the pace, worrying that he might follow, but he stood his ground, and shortly after we were out of range and I was on my way home. I tend to smoke a lot. I had this irrational fear when I got home and lit up a cigarette with my window open that someone might come in, and I was thinking of him specifically, though I live in an apartment on the 15th floor. Nothing happened, of course, and I went to sleep. To this hour I'm writing this, I remember vividly that same feeling I had when I encountered this man, and I can't shake it off. Somehow I get a mental image and visualize this man as I did back then. Somehow not human, and yet human enough not to be afraid in a way I would be of the deep supernatural. I guess only one word came to my mind when I think of him. A sort of vampire, though strangely enough it's not from any book of fiction or myth that I know of. But I keep sensing him like that, and I don't know why. I could tell myself that this was nothing out of the ordinary, but the experience and the feelings I went through were anything but ordinary. It stays in my mind. I can't ignore the images. I'm sure now more than ever this was not a human. I sensed he wasn't human from the first moment. Has anyone else ever had a similar experience? Weird. I don't really have many thoughts on that. If that is true, I can only be kind of scrutinizing and say it's a fictitious story, but I kind of don't really think it is, because I was having to amend phrases. When she mentioned she lived in Eastern Europe and her English was very broken. Yeah, on the previous story though, I guess that is plausible, isn't it? Just people who, it's not really an illness, but they've just convinced themselves that they're vampires and they need to drink blood, when realistically they